Hi, I'm Linda Eedes from Foord Asset Management, and I'm joined today by Rashaad Tayob, who is one of our portfolio managers and also our macroeconomic strategist. And we're going to be talking about something that is more pertaining to the latter today, and that is actually the dynamics that are shifting between the West versus the rest. Now, if we think about the contribution to world GDP, the US has been the dominant country for quite some time. But over the last decade, that has started to shift somewhat. So the US contributed just under 21% to world GDP in 2022. China is sort of champing at its heels at 16%. How do you view those long-term economic growth prospects changing over time?
Well, I think you've pointed out the two leading countries. The US is representative of the West, and China is really representative of the rest in terms of emerging markets, and especially Asia. And it's Asia that has driven global growth for the last few decades. If you look at GDP per capita, which is a crude measure, China started off with 1/40th of the wealth of the US, and as of now, it's still only 1/6. So that convergence, while it should slow down because a lot has happened, they've grown very strongly over the last few decades, that gap should continue to narrow, and we expect Asia to continue to drive growth going forward. Outside of Asia, the rest has actually been quite poor. They haven't been able to develop and grow sustainably if you look at Africa and Latin America, but you could say the same of the West outside of the US. The US has benefited from its very strong position in the important tech sector. Outside of that, its economy hasn't done particularly well. And if you look at Europe, it's languished because it's got a very small technological sector. So it's no surprise that when we look at the contestations economically, politically, militarily, these are between the United States and Asia.
So Rashaad, one of the groupings that one typically thinks about when they consider the rest is BRICS. And of course, that was originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And more lately, they've actually invited 6 more countries to join that grouping. And some of those countries are some of the biggest powers in the world in terms of the energy supply. And so there I'm talking about Iran, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia and the UAE. How does that sort of impact that balance of power shifting between the West and the rest in the coming years, do you think?
I think the developments that we've seen in BRICS this year in terms of the expansion, which is driven primarily by China, they've wanted to expand the role of BRICS. I think it has been a watershed change. Until this year, the BRICS was just another multilateral institution, get together for a conference every 2 years, and then not much comes of it. But I think now there's a strong desire to establish the BRICS as a consortium of countries to contest against the West as for global power. And I think you're going to see more of that. In relative basis, the West has been in decline because they started from such a dominant position. So it only makes sense that as the world develops, if you look at countries like China and India, they're unrecognizable from where they were 2 decades ago. So it's no surprise that economic power is shifting, and where economic power shifts, military and political power follows. So I think it's no surprise that you are seeing these contestations, and BRICS will be the base by which the rest of the world looks to increase their influence on the global political system.
Now, we know that obviously South Africa is firmly entrenched within BRICS, but we sit in an interesting position from a trade perspective. If you actually consider who we export to, we're actually much more reliant on the West. So we export around 11% of our exports go to China, but if you add up the US, Europe, and the UK, that actually makes up more than 1/3 of our exports. We do import quite a bit from China and India. That's about 20% if you look at the two of them together. And we do increasingly, though, from a political perspective, seem to be siding with the rest, despite the fact that we are still very reliant on exports going to the West. How do you see that playing out in terms of our country, in terms of those kind of dynamics?
From a trade perspective, we're a commodity exporter, so we're quite agnostic about who we sell our products to. I think we're happy to sell to Asia, to China, India, as well as the US and Europe. They're all quite important to us. From a capital flow perspective and a financial perspective, we are still very integrated with the Western economies. We're dependent on them for a lot of capital flow. So they're still a very important part of our economy. Recently, we have been roped into siding with the BRICS countries in geopolitical disputes, but I think that it's a mistake for us at the southern tip of Africa to get involved in global political issues. I think sometimes our politicians they overestimate our influence on the world, and therefore they can be a bit rash and in terms of their decisions and their statements. You have to remember that the country that most benefits from the war is the one that doesn't fight it. So I think we should remain independent. We should get the benefits of the BRICS, being part of the BRICS consortium. We've borrowed money from the BRICS Bank. We've also borrowed money from Washington institutions like the World Bank. So I think it's best to remain independent and get the best of being part of the BRICS economy, as well as being part of the developed world.
So now it's all very fascinating to talk about these things, but at the end of the day, we have to consider this within our investment decision making. Does this play any role in terms of how we invest in our portfolios?
I think the importance of the shifts that we're seeing can't be ignored. The US was the dominant power post-World War II. It was probably the greatest empire in history, and on a relative basis, it has been in decline. And with that, you are seeing contestations for power, be it with Russia and Ukraine, be it in Asia with China, or be it now in the Middle East. So as the US declines in economic, political, and military importance, you are seeing contestations for power, and I think geopolitical risk will be elevated relative to what we've been seeing historically in a multipolar world that we expect going forward. So I think in that context, we have to look at our portfolios and our holdings, which are going to be robust to these geopolitical risks. An example of that would be gold, which has long-term been a store of value, and it's been a hedge against geopolitical risk. And if we expect that to remain elevated going forward, I think gold will continue to play an important part in our portfolio. We also have to look at economic shifts, and I mentioned Asia has been the biggest driver of economic growth. It will continue to be. And because of that, a large portion of the middle class population of the world has been shifting and will continue to shift from the West to Asia. In fact, 2/3 of the global middle class will be in Asia by the end of this decade. So we have to look for companies and investments we can tap into that opportunity set.
Okay, well, I think this is a conversation we're going to have to keep having as things unfold. Thanks very much, Rashaad, for your contribution. And thanks to everyone who has been listening today. Take care.